evolution can't be true. Because if evolution is true, then that would mean that there is death before the fall described in Genesis chapter 3. And if there's no death and no suffering before the fall, then evolution can't be true. At least that's how some people argue it. Well, what if it was actually possible for there to be death before the fall? What if death was actually a part of God's very good creation? That's an interesting thought. So, let's talk about it today on the Science and Faith podcast. One of the main problems that people who deny evolution have with the theory of evolution is not actually the science behind evolution. It's some of the theology behind evolution. The biggest objection being that if evolution is true, then that would mean that there was death before the fall. And the fall, as we know in Genesis chapter 3, was described by Paul in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 as the basis for there being death. So how in the world could there have been death before the fall? Well, it's a very interesting question. So I want to take just a minute to kind of dive into that a little bit and talk about the different possibilities. So first of all, there's the idea that the death that's being talked about by Paul in the New Testament and described in Genesis chapter 3 is that it was physical death. But it was a special kind or a different kind of physical death as we think about the difference between living and then dying, as in you're alive and then you're dead. It's a physical death, but it's not the kind of physical death that it didn't exist and then suddenly now it exists. When we talk about physical death before the fall, it's a physical death that is more than, it's more of a disturbing physical death. And so the idea was that prior to the fall, Adam and Eve would have simply died by passing on. It would have been a peaceful, restful death. And what sin did was it disrupted that form of death and made it far more bad or evil, so to speak. So for example, man was given the task of work. And so what sin did was now, before what would have happened is man would have simply completed his work and then would have passed on and would have died. Now, what sin has done is it has brought an unresolvedness to the work. And so people die all the time without having completed their mission, without having completed their work for which they were put on earth for. So that's just one aspect. The other aspect is that death is actually part of God's very good creation because it's essential to a good creation. In order for ecosystems to function well and to function and to create healthy environments, death is a very crucial part of healthy ecosystems. Unless organisms are dying and being replenished and populations are varying, what you get is a lot of instability. If all you have is population increase within an ecosystem, and if all these populations increasing, you get a massive amount of instability within an ecosystem. What death does is death brings balance to the ecosystem. And so for God to declare his creation very good, then what you would have to have is you'd have to have a very good ecosystem as well. And in order for you to have a very good ecosystem, you have to have death. You have to have organisms that are dying. If you have an ecosystem where bacteria is just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying and multiplying, what eventually you'll get are diseases and you'll get an imbalance in the ecosystem. And so for God's good creation to be very good, you have to have a very good ecosystem. You have to have death. So physical death was definitely, it seems, a possibility before the fall. And what is being described in terms of physical death is an intensifying of physical death in an unhealthy way, where physical death was good in a certain way, but now it has changed as a result of the fall and the introduction of sin. There's another interpretation about death before the fall, and that is that there was no... If Adam and Eve did not die, they were created very good, but they would have been susceptible to physical death. And the first argument is if God said to Adam and Eve, "Don't eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because if you do, then you will die. Well, then Adam and Eve they've never experienced death. How would they know what it means to die? The threat would have been meaningless to Adam and Eve. If they had no concept of death prior to their fall, how could God threaten them with death? It didn't exist. It must have existed before the fall, so Adam and Eve must have been familiar with it. Otherwise, God could not have made that threat. The other important thing to note is that there is within the garden, more than just the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there is the tree of life. Remember, after the fall, when Adam and Eve are being kicked out of the garden, God says we have to place an angel with a flaming sword, a cherub, to protect the garden, to protect the tree of life. Otherwise, they might go back in, or we've got to kick them out of the garden, because if we don't, they'll take of the tree of life and they'll eat of the fruit and they'll live forever. Well, if Adam and Eve were born, created immortal, and created without the possibility or capacity to die, why would there be a tree of life? It wouldn't make sense for there to exist a tree of life if Adam and Eve were created as immortal. It makes sense after if you believe that they fell and then they were susceptible to death. Well, that makes sense. We got to kick them out of the garden, because if they take and eat of the fruit of the tree of life, then they'll live forever. We don't want them to live forever. But why was the tree in the garden in the first place? What purpose would the tree of life serve? If Adam and Eve were created as immortal without death, why would there need to be a tree that gives people immortal and eternal life? It doesn't make any sense. Other than to say that Adam and Eve were not created as immortal beings. Rather, they were mortal, they were susceptible to death, but the fall intensified that death. The second aspect to this is that death was not a physical death, it was a spiritual death. The death that resulted from the fall was not physical death, but it was spiritual death. And it actually, if it makes a lot of sense, if you go back and you read Romans 5, and you actually, where it says death, and I've done this, and it's somewhat interesting. If you simply write the word spiritual above every occurrence of death, and then you go back and you read Romans 5, and you read spiritual death instead of just the word death, but you actually read spiritual death, it doesn't change the meaning of Romans 5 almost at all. There's almost no variance in the meaning of Romans 5 if you replace the word death with the phrase spiritual death. In other words, Paul's argument is still completely coherent if you understand that what he's arguing with there is not physical death, but spiritual death, the loss of the relationship between God and human beings, which again makes perfect sense if you go back to Genesis 3. What was it? God says that in the day you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. What happened? Did Adam and Eve surely die? In the day that they ate, did they die? No, they did not. Physically. They did not physically die. What did happen to Adam and Eve in the day that they ate of the fruit of the garden, the fruit of the tree? Well, they were kicked out of the garden. And that relationship, what was lost in the day that they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Was their physical life lost? No. What was lost? Their relationship with God. That's what was immediately lost, was that immediate relationship with God was broken. That intimacy, that deep, intimate relationship that Adam and Eve enjoyed in the garden was completely broken in the day that they ate. So in the sense, God's promise that in the day that they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they would die, they would surely die, God kept that promise. They did surely die, because in the day that they ate of the knowledge of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve spiritually died. They lost their intimate relationship with God. So, could physical death be a part of God's original plan for creation? Yes, it could, because without death, you could not have a very good creation, because you would have ecosystems that were completely out of balance and completely out of control. And so at the very least, you have to have animal death before the fall. Otherwise, you don't get a very good creation. You get a very bad creation without animal death, without physical animal death before the fall. Were Adam and Eve susceptible to physical death prior to the fall? Yes, it would seem that they were, because if they were not susceptible to physical death, it doesn't explain the existence of a tree of life. Why do you have a tree of life in the garden where Adam and Eve are commanded to live and work if Adam and Eve were created immortal without the possibility of dying? That doesn't make any sense. And so what you have is a sort of a coherent understanding of the role of death, that death itself is not bad. Death can be a part of God's good creation. How it's used and how it's been distorted as a result of sin has become a problem that has required the sacrifice of God's Son. I don't want to say that death itself is good, but I think what we can say is that death can be a part of a good creation. I think that's what's important to say, is that a part that without death, you don't get a very good creation, you get a very big problem. But with death in and a part of creation at a certain level, within a certain function, you do get a very good creation. So, is it possible that evolution then existed for millions of years with organisms dying and new organisms emerging and then dying out and then new ones emerging for millions of years prior to Adam and Eve in the fall? Yes, because that's what a very good creation looks like, is one that is gradually developing and unfolding, and where organisms die out and where bacteria is certain types of bacteria and other pathogens are able to die and be kept at bay and not spread disease all over the world. And so death is a very important part of a very good creation. So that's our podcast for today. If you have any questions or comments, and I'm sure there are people out there who would strongly object to this view, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. We'll do our best to respond and interact with you guys. If you want to email us directly, you can do that. The email address is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. You can go ahead and fire us off an email. We'll do our best to respond to you. Also, check out our website. We have other resources on this topic up there you can check out. We also post new articles, previous episodes of the podcast. Our website address is scienceandfaith.de. Go ahead and head on over there and you can check out, like I said, previous episodes of the podcast and other articles on this topic. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you here next time on the Science and Faith Podcast.